Hi.
Good morning, everyone present here in person and out in the telesphere. It is Wednesday, July 17th, 2024 at 9:05 a.m. And I will call to order the Steering Committee of Elected Officials for Spokane County, Washington. Could we call a roll, please?
Okay, Mayor Kevin Freeman,
Present.
Commissioner Al French,
Here.
Councilmember Rod Higgins,
Here.
Councilmember Kitty Clifford,
Present.
Councilmember Larry Bowman, Councilmember Michael Cathcart, Mayor Terry Cooper,
Present.
Councilmember Mickey is out of town, she will not be present. Mayor Chris Kaminskas,
Here.
Commissioner Josh Kearns,
Here.
Councilmember Paul Dillon,
Here.
Commissioner Amber Waldron,
Present.
Mayor Chris Grover, and Deputy Mayor Tim Hattenberg has conflicting schedules. The non-voting members, Joel White,
Here.
Tim Merle, Ned Wendell, Patrick Birch.
Here.
So we
Patrick's
do
here.
have, excuse me?
I wasn't sure if you could hear me, but I'm here.
So we do have a quorum of members and remotely. And so at this time, I would ask if there is a motion on the minutes from the May 15th, 2024.
I'll make a motion.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion from the membership? Any comments? Hearing or seeing none, all in favor of approval of the May 15th, 2024 minutes, please say aye.
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 Are there any opposed? Please say no. Hearing none opposed, the minutes are approved unanimously. And that brings us to the highlight of today, which is the nomination and election of a chair and vice chair for the 2024-2025 term. Typically, traditionally on this body, the vice chair moves to the chair role, which is at this time, Commissioner Al French is currently the vice chair. And so at this time, I would ask if there is a motion for election of Commissioner Al French to the chair role.
So move, Chris Kaminskas.
Is there a second?
Second, Rod Higgins.
Any discussion of this motion? Seeing or hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Are there any opposed? Hearing none opposed, Commissioner Al French is elected to chair of the Steering Committee of Elected Officials unanimously. And so at this time, I will virtually pass the gavel to our new chair, Commissioner French.
You know, Mayor Freeman, since you were there in the room and stuff, why don't you go ahead and finish out the rest of the meeting and then I'll catch the next one.
Oh, well, thank you, Chair French.
You're welcome.
All right, so at this time, we are looking for nominations for a vice chair. Traditionally, this body works on a rotational system amongst the membership between the county, the city of Spokane, the city of Spokane Valley, and then the small cities. It is my understanding that in the queue, the city of Spokane is next. However, as we know, that is always not necessary. But traditionally, it would be the city of Spokane. So at this time, I would be looking to the membership for nominations for vice chair of this body.
This is Commissioner Kearns. I will nominate Councilmember Michael Cathcart.
Second. Mayor Cooper.
Moved and seconded for Mr. Cathcart. Are there any other nominations? Seeing or hearing no other nominations, the vote for Councilmember Cathcart for Vice Chair. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Are there any opposed? Hearing none opposed, Councilmember Cathcart, you are now Vice Chair. Thank you very much. So that concludes our action items for today, and that leads us to our workshop. Our first workshop presentation is the PTAC presentation on proposed amendments to the countywide planning policies as related to housing.
Mr. Chairman Emeritus.
Yes, sir.
We're going to, as part of this item, we have asked the managing director of Commerce has graciously accepted to come speak to the group from Commerce perspective that leads right into this issue. So if we can, Dave Anderson, just somewhere, corner, is here to chat with the steering committee.
Great, Mr. Anderson, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. It is my pleasure. Back, got it. All right. So thank you for having me. Okay. Are you picking this up at a good level? Okay. Mayor Freeman, members of the committee, thank you for having me. Again, I'm Dave Anderson. I'm the managing director of the State Growth Management Program, here to talk to you about the housing target allocation process, which is changed fairly significantly for this particular periodic update. Those of you who were here for the last one will know that there was a process of allocating population as part of, and one of the foundational pieces of the periodic review process, both for the county and for all the member cities. And since that change, there have been significant changes to the housing element requirements, really designed to help address and grapple with both the state and the nation's need for housing choice and more housing affordability. And that has required a fairly significant expansion of the housing element requirements, and that has folded into a fairly significant change to the way population is allocated in the way, as it relates to the housing planning. So I'm getting here today. I'm here to talk to you about some of those changes and sort of how that cascades through the periodic update process as a whole. And I also have with me today from my team, Melissa Patulli, who is our representative for Spokane County, and my phone friend on the housing element, Laura Hodgson, is on the line. She's the person who is she's our policy lead on the development of the housing element guidance, and she'll be here to correct all the stuff I get wrong today. So a little bit of context. This is part of the periodic update process. Your periodic update is due June 30th of 2026. So that you share that with Lewis County or Cowlitz. No, is it? Yeah, you'll share that with Cowlitz and Skamania counties and all the other counties in sort of the larger metropolitan counties in Eastern Washington. And in terms of the update, what are you updating? You're reviewing your comprehensive plan and your development regulations, and you are updating them to address a number of things. In principle, you're really doing two things. One of them is you're addressing new statutory requirements, things that have changed in statute since the last time you adopted your plan. You haven't gone about and implemented some of those changes. This is the time you do that. And the second thing you're doing is you're sort of resetting your plan to address new data and new facts on the ground. So you're resetting the 20-year time horizon of your plan, and you're grappling with new information and new facts. That could include new science to inform your critical areas ordinance. It includes what has happened in the last 10 years or so on terms of your capital facilities plan. It also includes changes to population. When you're resetting your target, you're resetting your population, and that also means that necessarily means the target allocation process. And we are at this point now allocating housing units by income band rather than simply allocating population. That is the big change. Or you were allocating population. Now there's this requirement that you sub-allocate housing, that you do what's called a housing needs analysis, where you look at the need for housing by income band on a countywide basis, and then you allocate that out to the individual jurisdiction. So for each jurisdiction, they have to plan for housing by income band to make sure that we're grappling with all of the segments of the housing market. So your periodic update is not one decision, as any planning document is. It's always a series of nested decisions. If you've ever been to a public hearing on a planning issue, I bet you've heard somebody say this before. I don't know why we're here. I don't know why we're talking about this. You've already made this decision, haven't you? We already know what you're gonna do. You've probably heard it. You ever heard that at a public hearing? And there's always an element of truth to that, isn't there? Because every decision exists in context. And you're making some decisions today. Those are based on some decisions that have been made in the past. And some of the decisions are not right yet. So the decision always exists in context and builds on the past decisions. So this is sort of Can you see that or the red dot? Yeah. Okay.
Not online, no.
Okay, that's not showing up online. Okay, I'll dispense with the red dot then. So this is a series of nested decisions. We're talking about countywide planning policies today. You're going to get that from the PTAC. Then we're going to go through the target allocation process. My understanding is you've already made a decision about sort of the overall population target. That will then lead to the work that the individual cities do, the analytical work that's going to flow from the policy decisions that you make about the land capacity analysis and the housing needs analysis. That will then flow into your comprehensive plan, which is really going to establish the growth strategy for how are we going to make adequate provision for the housing and all the other land needs that we have in the community, and how are we going to do that, understanding the capital facilities we have today and the revenue we have available. That will then lead to the actual implementation of your plan, the development regulations you'll need to adopt, the capital facilities you're going to need to finance and construct, and then the individual projects that the development community is going to construct consistent with the plan, those regulations, and the available facilities. So you can see that there's a set of decisions that get implemented both during the periodic update process and then over the next 20-year period, to actually go about implementing your growth strategy. So this is the beginning of the process, and it's important that you maintain momentum and continuing to move through. One common pitfall you have in a process like this is to reach later in the stages and decide you want to go back and revisit prior decisions. That bears a significant risk of delaying the whole process. So it's important to not only to make decisions, but also keep those decisions made. Thoughtfully consider them, make the decision well, and then keep that decision made as you move forward. So countywide planning policies, they're really designed to govern those things that cities and counties necessarily have to grapple with together. And you can see among those, you've got housing affordability. So with the update of the housing element, that's necessarily going to mean, since that's a required component of the countywide planning policies, that's necessarily going to mean changes to the countywide planning policies to sort of define in writing how are we going to go about this new, more complicated target allocation process. So what does the housing element actually require? We have been directed as part of the legislation, some of all of the things on our to-do list was to create a set of housing targets and to take the OFM forecast number and to break that out by income band and to turn that into a housing target. Because remember, we're now allocating not people, we're allocating housing units by income band. So we're doing two things. The first thing that we're doing is we're translating population into housing units. And we've got a model that looks at things like average household size and also looks at production trends over the past few years. And that yielded sort of a statewide housing need. And that gets broken down by counties based on the OFM forecast, where we've actually identified what are the housing needs in total, and then broken those out by income band. It's a big number. It's 1 million housing units on a statewide basis. That's about a 10% increase over what we've been building. So a million's a big number. This is also a big segment of the economy. A lot of people build houses for a living, so it's doable. One of the reasons there's three things that are driving housing need. One of them is people continue to move to Washington. We continue to have growth. The second one is that average household size is declining. So you need more housing units to accommodate the same population because there's fewer of them. And the third one is we're still dealing with a hangover from the housing crash in 2008. We have been underproducing housing units for about 10 years. So we have a lot of catch up to do. We're coming out of a hole. We're trying to dig ourselves out of a hole. So those three things together are what's driving sort of the statewide housing need. And that's part of what's driving the housing need in Spokane County. I read the Spokane review that I think we've got about a 2.4 month supply in housing inventory. And they say a healthy market is around six months. So we're better, we're making progress, production is occurring, but we've got a big hole to come out of. So we then need to allocate that out by income band, and that includes moderate, low, very low, extremely low households, and also includes the need for permanent supportive housing. So yeah, I'll take them now. Yeah.
So a question for you, in your chart there, the last bullet point there talks about removing barriers for racially impacted communities. If you look at the 2000, 2010, and 2020 census data, you will see that communities of color, their percentage of home ownership has declined over the last 25 years and stuff. So what is the state proposing to do to turn that dynamic around? And when you talk about housing, you are not talking about just single family housing, you're also talking about multifamily housing. And so the opportunity for home ownership is diminished when there's all this focus on apartments, and the state still hasn't recovered with regard to condo legislation. So how do you change that dynamic around from what's been happening for the last 25 years?
Well, in terms of what occurs in the housing element, the duty that the local governments have is to identify if there are any regulations that they have that have had a racially disparate impact. We've got some guidance out there. I'm going to call my phone a friend. Laura, can you talk about the guidance that we have and the recommendations we have on addressing racially disparate impacts?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yes, this is a big area of concern, and one that as a state, we are looking at in a number of different ways, including beefing up our housing trust fund and our equitable distribution of housing resources, as well as starting a new home ownership unit in our housing division to focus on home ownership opportunities. Because as you said, those households who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color generally have lower homeownership rates, and it's startling that the facts. So we're looking at a variety of different things, including community land trusts and opportunities for manufactured home parks to be purchased and operated cooperatively to address displacement risks and to allow people to stay in their homes. But from a local perspective, as Dave mentioned, we have guidance on how jurisdictions can identify what those racially disparate impacts are, have policies and local policies as well as national policies led to potentially racially disparate impacts, and we have data to support that. And then local governments are asked to look at, in addition to what policies may have led to that, how they can change their policies and focus on ways to address and undo those racially disparate impacts. And that happens through a variety of different methods. They can encourage more housing in a variety of different housing types and include some of those lower income affordable housing options through community land trusts and potentially even manufactured home parks where that are cooperatively owned. We do recognize that the condo industry and the condo regulations are a hurdle, and there was a study recently by the Affordable Housing Advisory Board to look into that. But in addition to just encouraging a variety of different housing types, including middle housing and, as I mentioned, community land trusts, jurisdictions can also encourage that preservation of their existing affordable housing, as well as preventing displacement of their current residents by encouraging very sensitive, very careful considerations when they do their upzonings. But we have a variety of different tools identified in our racially disparate impacts guidance and that local governments can customize to work to address that. And I'm happy to speak more on that, but I think I might have covered it, but I will defer to Dave and you if you have additional questions.
Thanks, Laura. So in addition to what I just talked about in terms of future housing need by income bracket, we are producing, once you've got your targets, then you talk about identifying sufficient capacity of land for housing, making adequate provision, and then, as we just discussed, identifying racially disparate impacts. So this is the basics of what the new housing element requirements are.
But this isn't addressing home ownership. It's just addressing housing, correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the two are a combination. There's not specific obligations associated with home ownership. But when you're talking about racially disparate impact, there's something to be done there. When we talk about home ownership, there are things that are being done at the state level associated with housing finance that are sort of beyond the span of control of what a local government would do with their development regulations or with their planning process. So this is one of those issues where addressing the full scope of the problem is going to require more than just those things the local government can do, okay? In order to really address this problem, the local governments are going to have to take some steps. State government's going to have to take some steps. Federal government's going to have to take some steps, and the private market is going to have to take some steps. So when we're talking about the housing element and the planning process and the periodic update, remember that's just those things that a local government can do, okay? Nobody is expecting that local governments acting on their own, using all of their own authority, are going to be able to solve this problem all on their own. Nobody's expecting that. Nobody that's realistic is expecting that. The state government's going to have to step up. Some of the things that Laura was talking about in terms of the things we're doing on home ownership are some of the steps the state is taking. The substantial investment in things like the housing trust fund are things the state's doing. It's going to take everybody. So when we're talking here, we're talking about those things that local governments have a duty to do as part of their planning program, recognizing that that's not on its own going to be enough. That make sense, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely.
So kind of related to this point, what does it mean to actually plan for and accommodate? Remember, local governments don't build housing units. The private market is the ones that actually do the construction. So Part of that is land, that's one of the things you do with the housing needs analysis and your land capacity analysis. It's determining, have we actually allocated enough land with the correct entitlements that you can actually build the housing? Is it actually legal to build the housing? Can you actually pull a permit for the housing at a sufficient number of the sufficient types to actually construct the housing that's necessary? Are you allowing the types of housing that would allow the private market to address the affordability issues? Have you identified and looked at ways to remove barriers that have been an issue in the past with constructing affordable housing? It doesn't mean you go out and build it yourself, but it means that you take a look at making sure that we are actually preparing the market, both in terms of capital facilities and also in terms of the regulations themselves to do that. So how do we go about identifying what the housing needs are? The countywide planning policies is going to talk about how you go about doing the distribution. We've already got the county population projection. The county, once you've got your countywide population growth target, that then you can use the commerce tool that then breaks that target out by income band. Okay, that translates population to housing units and then breaks that out by income band. And then it's a matter of determining, which I think the threshold you're crossing right now is the process of taking those housing units in each income band and allocating those out to the individual jurisdictions. So when an individual jurisdiction is looking for a target, that's their target. And then allocating those housing needs by income level. So one of the challenges associated with the housing element process is the housing element requires that you look at targets by income band, but we don't regulate housing by income band. Okay, you don't say we're going to zone this area for people in this income band and this area for people in that income band. That's you don't have the statutory authority. You don't even have the constitutional authority to do that. And even if you could, it would really be bad policy. What we do is we regulate housing type. So one of the things we've done in our guidance is we've tried to give a rough translation for what housing types can you actually build at different price points, because multifamily units are significantly cheaper on a unit per unit basis to construct because it takes less land, takes less infrastructure. You can spread out your land across more housing units, accommodate more households on the same piece of land, which is a significant fraction cost. So when we look at it, this is kind of what we've identified as a translator. If you're talking about a new single family detached structure, that's probably going to be 120, 120. That's going to be the highest income band. It's really almost impossible to produce a new single family detached home for something less than that. It's just too expensive. Middle housing and ADUs, that'll get you down to 30 to 50. Apartments have some ability to get you below that. That's also where you're going to find a lot of your permanent supportive housing. Yes, Scotty?
Maybe tying back to what Al was saying, that middle housing piece.
Yeah.
Do you think commerce will help play a role in condo legislation reform? Because that's where the ownership for the low, for maybe that 80 to 120 could be in fact an owned property if the state laws had been.
Yeah, and we have played a role in the past, and we're looking for solutions in the future. I think if we're going to address home ownership, we're going to need to find ways to produce condominiums. I think one of the things that could help with that is the middle housing rules. Because rather than trying to build a 200 unit structure as a condominium where you've got all of the liability issues associated with condos in a really big structure, doing it in a smaller structure, I think is going to probably simplify that process, at least to a certain degree. There are also things you can do under the middle housing laws in terms of how the units are structured. Thing to remember is there's Condominiums are not a separate housing type, they're not a different structure, okay? They're a means of structuring ownership. So you could have two buildings that look exactly the same, could have very different ownership structures, simply in terms of how the deal is structured. Let's say you've got 4 units in a townhouse, okay? That could be one building renting, one person owns it, one lot, and they're renting 4 units out. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is you could have actually 4 lots created from that parcel. And then you've got 4 units. The person who owns it owns the land underneath and the structure. And then there's some common ownership of some of the outside stuff. Or you could have that as your condominium. One parcel owned in common, outside walls owned in common, individual units owned separately. Out from the outside, it would look exactly the same. If you showed up at the permit counter, you'd pull a permit for that exactly the same. It's not a change in use. It's a change in how the deal is structured in terms of how the units are sold. Not a different housing type.
Commissioner French.
Yeah. Commissioner French?
Yeah, if you build a 300 unit apartment building, you know, from the outside, and you started to touch on this, Mr. Anderson, is that that 300 unit apartment building could be a 300 unit condo building. And the idea that you're going to build 4 unit condo projects doesn't help in terms of the price. You end up spending an inordinate amount of money on capital facilities, sewer, water, and everything else for a smaller project that you can't spread out over a larger project. So, you know, I'm just really challenged by why the state seems to think that 12 units is the magic number, when in fact you can build a 300 unit apartment building. Nobody gives it a second thought. And quite frankly, other than the ownership structure, that's the only thing different in the structure itself. Thank you.
I can piggyback on some of that where we are. So in Millwood, if you start thinking about it, first of all, we don't allow 0 lot lines. So we're not gonna get townhomes. Second, even if we did, every individual lot has to have own sewer and water. So you've got 4 sewer services that if that developer is gonna put in, or 6 sewer services. So those GFCs, those facilities charges, capital, everything gets added on to that. And that's kind of our legislation. So I would say to some of that, but can we go back to your original slide? Does any of
And I would also offer, I didn't mean to derail our conversation with the condo idea. I just wanted in that slide, the idea that a condo ownership model can in fact provide some opportunity for ownership in that middle group.
Because what is our AMI in Spokane County? 70,000. So, you know, if you're looking at 30 to 50% of that, that's not gonna get anywhere. So like Commissioner French is saying, and like Scott's saying, is we need to have a different model other than a single family for home ownership.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
And I didn't want to get us totally distracted on.
And just having known the market side of this is if I'm a private investor and I'm looking at a model of how I'm going to generate the most income. The rental property will generate more income over time than a selling the property. You get a one-time larger cash flow, but if you rent it, over time, it's a much better investment. So you can put all the rules in, but you don't want to put the land use regulations unless you start mandating certain uses, and that's, I don't really get. Like we said, there's challenges with that. So I'm saying is from an investor's standpoint, they're gonna say, I'm gonna rent this property versus making it a owner occupied. You make it a condo. There are condo conversions where you could do the existing multifamily rental property, change it to a condo, and that's been done in our area and like other places we've seen that. So there are opportunities. I'm not saying we can't do that. I know we got some property in downtown Spokane or developed as rentals have probably been transferred to condos at some point in time. That was thankfully was the intent, was it spoken, it was the intent, so. Those things are happening in our community, but I have to say that's the challenge, is that investors going to look at what's the best interest of that investment.
And there's, the town's full of single family detached homes that are currently rented. And they move back and forth between the rental and the ownership market all the time. I think this again is one of those things that's going to require more than just the work that a local government can do as part of the planning process. Which really comes to the question now, what flexibility, what discretion are you actually exercising at this point? Back to the public participation and helping people to understand the series of nested decisions. One of the things that I think is critical, helping people understand, is making sure that there's a clear description of, at this stage of the process, what discretion are we currently exercising on behalf of the public? So here we're talking about flexibility. What are the sideboards in terms of decisions of local governments? Okay, we've got the population growth target within the OFM range. We're now talking about how much of the allocation goes to each jurisdiction. How are we going about doing that allocation? Okay. Cities and their counties don't choose total projected housing need. Projected housing needs by income level, how that distributes out. That all comes out of our model. Okay. So you can't just decide we're going to plan that, we're going to assume that somehow magically everyone's going to be 120% AMI. That's not a decision that's on the table. It's not a realistic assumption. So those come from our HAP tool, housing allocation planning tool. Right now, I believe where you're at is talking about how you, within each income band, how do you allocate that out on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. So some things to consider when you're going about making those decisions. Land capacity. What types of housing can serve different income levels? I think we've already talked about that. Where the affordable housing should be located. One of the things is we would caution against is expecting that a lot of, or really much of any of the deeply affordable housing is going to be available, should be allocated to the rural areas. Now, we know there's a lot of poor folks that live in the rural areas, but when we're talking about the future, we should not count on the ability to construct a lot of affordable housing in the rural areas. Once you put a well in, once you grade a driveway, once you're talking about a piece of land that large, it's just not possible to build it affordably. And a lot of that's going to mean folks that are going to be really struggling for transportation if they're living in a more isolated area. So we know that there are people in the rural areas that are struggling financially, but we shouldn't plan that that's going to be a source of a lot of housing in the future. That's not a strategy for creating new affordable.
Questions for Mr. Anderson? From the floor. Question, Kimberly?
So as we're embarking on this next effort to figure out where the affordable housing is divided, throughout the county. There's like this method A, this method B. We talked about that at our last steering committee meeting, and then there's this maybe a method C. So do you have any thoughts on other communities and what they've been doing around, like what you're just saying?
Yeah.
You want to make sure that there is housing throughout the community for different income levels, but you also have to consider services and transportation and access points, employment.
Yeah.
So is there a best practice out there that other communities that are starting to do are in our same planning timeframe that they're looking at a method C that's gonna work to figure that out?
Jump in briefly.
Are you gonna present something
We're
today?
gonna be talking exactly about that,
Okay,
after David's done.
anyway, I just
Yeah.
wondered from a commerce
Yeah.
perspective, it just seems like A and B are very flat. It's like looking at where the housing already is and then kind of calculating from that, or where trying to divide it out equally, which really doesn't work when you're looking at those nuances.
Yeah, I'm not sure that either of those methods are necessarily gonna work out the box.
Right,
Really, it's a question of what's fair. What do we, different cities and counties get together, one of the ways we're looking at is whatever the share was before, we're gonna assume it's gonna be the continued share in the future. The other one is we're gonna reallocate so that everyone, regardless of what the allocation was in the past, we're gonna reallocate so it's more even across the board. I think everyone's gonna end up in some combination of the two. Laura, you've been working with the Central Puget Sound jurisdictions. They're the first ones out of the gate, and I know Clark County's working hard and Whatcom County's working hard. Laura, do you have any observations from the deliberations that have occurred elsewhere in the state on this topic?
Yeah, I think with regard to the 2024 jurisdictions, a lot of those jurisdictions, based on the timing of our guidance and the numbers, didn't have a lot of time to have all of the thoughtful deliberations that you're able to have based on the timing of your periodic update. So quite a few of those jurisdictions just went with one of the methods that we have off the books, and then which is often method A. A few of the jurisdictions had some very thoughtful negotiations about where more affordable housing should go, and that was particularly King County. They had a very long process of figuring out, based on their comprehensive or countywide planning policies, where they wanted more affordable housing to go. And they had a bunch of different models and were looking at a bunch of different levers. And in short, they suggested that if you're looking at things from a number of metric standpoints, to reduce the number of metrics that you use. So they used the 3 different metrics to prioritize where more affordable housing goes. And that would be where more affordable housing was not currently, where there was a higher proportion of, I think it was low-wage jobs to households, and then one other. So that was the approach they took. For the 2025 jurisdictions, a lot of them are in the middle of this right now. Not many 2026s are doing this work yet. You're kind of ahead of the game for 2026s. But for 2025s, a lot of jurisdictions, they have more of a rural component to their counties than the Puget Sound region. So they're having a lot of these discussions about how do they shift more affordable housing to the cities and the urban growth areas. So they're actively working on that and still having their conversations. Not all 2025s have figured that out, but I think Skagit County is one good example where they decided that they agree with the principle that it's very, very difficult to build new affordable housing in rural areas. So they've allocated more of the deeply affordable housing to their cities and urban growth areas. Beyond that, I'm not always privy to all the decisions that are happening on the table with regard to growth. And some are taking the numbers and slightly modifying in them, or some are just mainly having that big conversation about where that deeply affordable housing goes. So again, it's all custom based on your local policies, and that's where we recommend that you fall back on those countywide planning policies, or all those principles that you are going to use to guide the process, because they will really help in this process.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, what's the plan going forward? Once this is established and adopted in place, we've identified the anchor bands and where we want those in different jurisdictions. Is there a plan by Commerce to monitor in any sort of ongoing way if we're hitting those numbers, if we're deviating? And then do you see anything in the future that might turn this sort of more into a mandate rather than, just needing to permit and allow certain housing types?
Well, I can tell you that we've got an organization called the Washington Center for Real Estate Research that is producing annual numbers where they're looking at production, and they're looking at 5 different types. They're also looking at sort of the rental value side of it. So we will have hard data to look at how, how the market is responding to these different changes. There is a requirement that's relatively new that requires cities, not all cities in the state, but big cities in the big metro areas, including the city of Spokane. They have to do what's called an implementation progress report. So that will be due 5 years after the end of your periodic update cycle. You'll have to, I think that's 2031 for you. You'll be producing an implementation progress report that will be really answering two questions. First one is, from the last periodic update till now, have we actually implemented the things we said we were going to implement? And two, did it work out the way we thought it was going to work out? And if not, what are we going to do differently? One of the things about this is there's going to be some assumptions built into the conclusion that we reach in 2026 that, yeah, we have a growth strategy that we think, based on the information we have now, we think is going to work. Okay. We don't know. That's the best information we have. We will need to adapt to what we find out. So there's going to be some core assumptions associated with if we allow types of housing that we haven't allowed before. If we allow housing in areas we haven't allowed before, how is the market going to respond to that? Our production number is going to change. Our endogenous factor is going to come in and spawn the whole thing. I mean, I think one of the things we said is that local governments can pull absolutely every lever they have as hard as they can, and interest rates can come in and crash housing production. So, there's going to be some hidden dodge in these things that happen, but we're going to be able to look, hopefully, in 2031 to see whether or not the assumptions we make about whether the interventions in the housing element have achieved the result we hope they were achieving, and if not, what are we going to do differently for the next update cycle? So it's going to be a matter of adapting this adaptively over time. You can't do that on an annual basis because it just takes a few years worth of data. And it takes a while for the market to decide exactly how it's going to respond to changes. The jury's still out on exactly how the market's going to respond to the middle house. There's a lot of new opportunity that's been unlocked by the changes to the development regulations that you've done before at House Bill 1110 and that the rest of the state is now catching up to. We'll find out exactly how the housing market responds to that. Based on what we've seen from places like Los Angeles, I'm pretty optimistic that the market's going to find out how to take advantage of those opportunities. Some people are not going to do anything at all. Other people are going to come in and they're going to figure out how to do it. They're going to make a killing. So eventually the market's going to figure out how to respond to that. We just don't know what that looks like. And it'll be a while before we do. But sometime around 2031, we'll be able to look back at the data we have available and adjust from there.
So we have Commissioner Kearns, and then I'd like anybody else to either raise their hand, because in the interest of time, we kind of need to move along to our next agenda item. So Commissioner Kearns.
Thank you. Sir, when you were talking about the method A, method B, and the potential for a method C, you said that, we hope for an outcome that's fair. I assume, Commerce's definition of fair is what's going to help kind of all of us come to that decision of A, B, or C, and is probably going to play a big part in whether at the end of the day we end up in court over whether we picked A, B, or C. So can you tell us what Commerce's definition of fair is and potentially what unfair would look like?
Well, I mean, fair is really what the individual jurisdictions believe is fair. Our ultimate bottom line is that you reach a decision and that the total amount that you allocate actually adds up to the total amount you're obligated to allocate. I think one of the things that fair is going to look like is nobody, the process isn't running roughshod over anybody. But that's one of the things that countywide planning policies are designed to hash out, is how are we going to do this in a way that sees that everyone agrees is going to be fair.
Hopefully, Commissioner Kearns, that answered your question. So if there are no further questions from anyone, I'd like to thank Mr. Anderson and move on to our agenda item.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So we are looking at our PTAC presentation, please.
While we're getting ready, we will distribute to the members and your PTAC counterparts, the slide deck that Dave shows, so you can see all of what he had.
Okay, thank you very much. Just as a brief way of introduction to those who haven't met us. I'm Bongo Thompson, one of the long range planners in Spokane County, working on the housing element along the way.
I'm Tate Andre, also working on all the housing stuff for the county.
So we're going to start off talking about HAPS, following up on what Dave was discussing, and then we're going to do a little bit about this countywide planning policies as well. Hello, where do I point this thing to? Oh, there, just take it. Okay. So as this to kind of a brief recap, which Dave touched on briefly. Out of the gate from Commerce, we have two main methods. Method A, which allocates housing based on the growth rate from 2020 to 2046, and method B, which allocates based on the projected share of population. You see, that's a mistake on that. I meant to say in 2046, not from 20. So my apologies. Share of projected population in 2046. And then one quick note, Commerce has developed an update of method A that has what we call kind of A prime internally. And A prime has a couple different features with it. One of them being it delineates between urban and rural growth. So the benefit of that is that it bakes in Commerce's guidance of not assigning low-income housing to rural areas, along with that broad unincorporated county allocation. So you get it for the UGAs and for the rural areas. You have the ability to split growth between specific UGAs. This raises some issues in the context of Spokane County. So if we end up going this way, we may or may not use that specific piece of A prime, but in either case, PTAC is using this sort of as the hypothesis, the starting point for our work on housing allocation. We're going to keep looking at every methodology and exploring any potential alternatives asked for by this body, but that's kind of what we're using as our starting point or our hypothesis. So we're going to talk about a little bit about some method C's we've developed, just kind of some philosophical or draft ideas. We've not done the mathematical analyses. So last SCEL meeting, excuse me, it was asked for PTAC to look into potential alternative methods. So we developed two here, one being a weighted transit model, where we would essentially tinker with the method A allocation based on planned transit availability. A quick little snag on this one, STA plans for a different horizon. So it would be well, in terms of, what's the phrasing I'm looking for? We have a good idea of what they're gonna do 5-10 years from now, not 20 years, it gets a little hazier after that. And then you could factor in other weights as needed. And then our second proposal, just as a brief note, we call it the AMI split. That's a mistake on my part, because we don't have reliable AMI numbers for every jurisdiction. So a better way to say this would be based on wages or something rather than AMI, but in either case. This would start again with method A and then address the allocations essentially based on wages within the jurisdiction. So if there are a lot of folks who are lower income in a jurisdiction, you might assign more low-income housing to that jurisdiction. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what other counties have done, which, excuse me, Laura and Dave touched on very briefly. So we have 4 counties that have done a method C. Lewis County, which for our purposes is not super applicable, but they essentially adjusted the allocation a little bit to assign more housing to cities along the I-5 corridor. And then King County, excuse me. Oh gosh, I didn't mention everything. Okay. King County has 3 different weights that they use. They take, how to phrase this? Essentially, they look at how much housing is currently affordable to people making 0 to 80% of the AMI? How much housing is income restricted to 0 to 80% AMI? And they have a way of tracking that we do not in the county. So if we want to do that, we'd have to sort that out. But and then just a brief clarification on this third point here. What we mean to say is the ratio of low-income jobs to low-income housing. That is how they do it. So if you have a whole bunch of low-income jobs in a jurisdiction, but not much low-income housing, you kind of allocate it more of that low-income housing so that people can live and work in that same jurisdiction. Skagit County did something very similar to what the updated method A is, essentially removing low-income housing from rural areas in the allocation. And then Snohomish County, essentially, Snohomish was a little bit difficult to look into because their methodology was slightly hazy, but essentially what they did was take method B and then get rid of the negative distributions, kind of zero it out. Yeah, so that's the end of the HAPS portion of this presentation, so I will open it up for questions if we want to, or we can get into the CPPs.
No, we are running a little short.
Questions?
Yes.
So to follow up on the King County method, you said that so they have a better way of tracking housing that is affordable. Do they have like a rental registry or something like that?
I don't know the exact wording. We spoke to them yesterday, which is one of the reasons why this is slightly out of date, but they have, I think it's a real-time sort of way of monitoring the number of affordability covenants they have. Kevin, I see you with your hand up.
Well, finish your thought, and that's.
Yeah. That's the best I can describe it. I don't think it's.
They, just to clarify, they have an income restricted affordable housing database, which allows them to do that.
Right, yeah.
Chime in.
Kevin, is that what you were gonna add?
No, and I appreciate Laura adding it. What I was gonna say was more general, and that is, oftentimes when we look at King County and the methods that when we've discussed them, in fact, one thing we've learned very quickly is that they have entities like the Puget Sound Regional Council that provide a level of data and a level of information that we don't have here ready-made. Right. So oftentimes when we look at King County, or we look at jurisdictions like Seattle and Tacoma, we find that their approach isn't a ready-made approach for this region. And that's just a general addition. And that happens a lot where there's a database that we don't. That would be nice if we had it. It doesn't exist.
Like the county has information on like the covenants and low income housing that we have contributed to, and so does the city, but it's not all in one place in Spokane. Okay,
It's not prepackaged, ready to go.
got it.
I guess just one quick thing I would ask about. I'm hearing interest from this body on a method C or discussion about that, and I know we're short on time, but I'm gonna go back to the ones we developed quickly. I guess I would just ask this body if they have feedback to provide on these or other things you would like us to factor in. And then we can look into implementing those. So if there's any feedback from the room or online, we would certainly love to hear it.
Anybody out there have any feedback on either of these C1 or C2?
Councilman Gephardt.
Yeah, not specifically, but I just think, you know, we should have, whether it's through a subcommittee or just the full body, but a kind of in the weeds discussion of the pros and cons of all the different bands and where they go and all of that, more in depth. I mean, you know, the city of Spokane has a pretty substantial share of lower income folks, and of course, there are abundance of services in the city of Spokane as well, so I understand that, but I do think that it would make a lot of sense for us to have pretty big discussion on what that looks like.
Yeah, we've been having very in the weeds discussions with PTAC on this. In terms of involving the SEO, we're certainly open to doing that as well. That would be helpful.
We are trying to be respectful of your time as well, because we've got this, we have the ILA subcommittee, we've got other, you know, how much time can you devote to?
Yeah, I just get the sense, I think at our last meeting, you know, there's a individual from Beverly Heights, they made some comments, and I'm just not so sure this is gonna be a simple outcome, so.
We agree, and PTAC definitely agrees. And that's partially a big reason why we had Commerce come and Dave as managing director to talk about that. We saw a slide here's where counties that have jurisdiction, here's what we can't do. And so we're starting to lay those parameters out on our guardrails. It's like we can't just have a wide open process, we have to stay within these parameters. But absolutely, and one thing that didn't necessarily show up on this version of C, but we've talked about historically, and Seattle or King County did talk about that. Percentage of low income households versus jobs. If we, rather than a transit rate, can we allocate this in a way that people can walk to work? So they don't necessarily have to have a car or by transit. So there are at least those variants that PTAC is working.
I would suggest, and I realize I'm not chair, I would suggest that jurisdictions, before we convene another committee or subcommittee, jurisdictions each go back and respectfully talk with your own planning departments and fully understand what they've generated out of the PTAC. And we need to be educated on this if we're going to come in and talk about this in the weeds, to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts or retreading ground that PTAC has already trod over many times in doing this. So yeah, I understand that as electeds, we need to weigh in on this, but let's weigh in mindfully and be up to speed and use our own resources first before we come down here and beat a deceased equine some more. So that's the only suggestion before we convene another committee.
Mayor Cooper's had an effort, and we'll circle to Mayor Cooper.
I was just gonna add and answer the question that our jurisdiction is in support of some method of C, but I think that it needs some more discussion. Spend quite a bit of time with our planning folks to wrap my mind around what's best. And so C is definitely where I want to go, but I think I need to understand better, to your point, you know, the difference between C1 and C2 and those impacts. You know, we're rural, even though we're not considered rural, we are. And so C would fit best for us. That's it.
Commissioner Water.
So just a couple thoughts. I mean, hopefully if STA in their planning process is looking at where jobs are, different paying jobs, you would hope that the transit piece would fit with that, but it doesn't. I mean, I know SRTC looks at where jobs are, and then STA takes that and looks at where the transit should go. So, I mean, I just think it's important we stay in close contact as STA is doing its update. But hopefully those things would align. That would be my hope. But the idea of looking at where those different types of job centers are, I think is a really good idea. And then the AMI, the C2 here, the challenge is always that there's two kind of, sometimes you could see them as conflicting policies. You know, there's the goal to avoid the concentration of low-income housing in a particular part of our county. But yet there's also the goal of mitigating displacement and exclusion. So you're constantly trying to figure out, you know, how do you not displace people from a neighborhood that culturally they want to stay in? But what if that's a lower income area that's very concentrated? Do you want to add more low income housing to that area? So it's an interesting dynamic. So there's two policies that work. They don't work against each other, but they can seem like they're conflicting if you're just looking at allocating more low income to where people are already lower income. So those are just my thoughts as we move forward.
Yeah, and just a brief note on that. We did speak with King County yesterday, as you mentioned, and that's one of the things they discussed, which I would agree with, is that we want to avoid kind of creating perverse incentives or, you know, just perpetuating the cycle, which is one of the concerns that I personally have with the transit model is, I mean, beyond the difficulty with implementation in terms of, you know, SDA just doesn't have the same planning horizon as we do. I think we all know if we assign based on transit, significantly more of it's just going to end up in the city. And then, you know, we don't want people to not plan for transit because they don't want certain kinds of housing. But in either case, I believe Councilwoman Klitsky, I believe you had your hand up.
Thank you. I think, sorry, I don't have my camera figured out, but I think that what Commissioner Waldorf says is a good point about employment centers. I think being more prescriptive, like if we had an overlay with transit, but also an overlay with employment centers and what types of jobs those are, and making sure that the right kind of housing is nearby would be helpful. We have a lot of service industry jobs and lower wage jobs spread throughout a lot of our county. And sometimes those folks have to drive pretty far or ride transit pretty far to get to those jobs. It would make the most sense to look at those employment centers and where the jobs are, where the housing should be. So maybe adding another overlay if we're going to also consider transit as an overlay.
Certainly, and I guess I can say over in 2 months and just let you know what you'd be looking at, and then get your thoughts on it now. What we would essentially be doing with that is doing something very similar to what King County did, looking, at least to my mind, maybe other members of PTAC would disagree, this is just speaking for myself. We would probably end up with something quite similar to the ratio of jobs to housing, so that's essentially what it would turn out. You know, the income of positions relative to the affordability. So that's kind of what we would get. And I suppose I'd like to see if there's interest from this body in something to that effect. Councilman Campbell.
Question, how do you account for, in those situations, you do often have, not always, but often have folks that, you know, they share a household, they, maybe they're younger, they're gonna move out of the household, I mean, but they're working lower income positions, and so when we account for this, is it a 1-to-1? Are we saying for every one low income position, there should be one low income household? Or is there a sort of an average? Like, how does that work?
So there's definitely different ways we could do it. We could do something where we take 80% of method A, you know, just keep it as is, and then 20% we assign based on that ratio. So we could do it to whatever specifications the steering committee is interested in. But yeah, it would probably be some degree of take this straight from HAPT, one of the methods, and then tweak it a little bit.
I would say conceptually, if that's an interest of this body to pursue, then we could answer your question a lot more, and we could dive into King County's methodology and how they did the wage to housing ratio and all that, because I think that's up in there right now in terms of how that would mathematically work out.
And then just one more follow-up on that. When you're looking at that, how broad are we looking? So are you looking at the intensity in a very macro kind of level, you know, a 4-block by 4-block radius, or are we looking at the entire jurisdiction? How is it observed from that standpoint?
I'm gonna answer this real quick, and I'll get to you, Kevin. King County is still working on their methodological paper, and we've only spoken to them briefly, so I don't have a great understanding of how they did it to that level of detail. My assumption is that we would be looking at it on a jurisdictional basis and then going based on that. Kevin.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is at the PTAC level, at the subcommittee, we're 2 levels down in the subcommittee for the PTAC. We've discussed these methods in general, but those details we're not clear on yet. But when it comes to things like your original question, is it 1-to-1? Is that the ratio? That is where we would probably want to come up with some concept of what that might be, and then get into it.
Okay.
Because there isn't the best practice here. As much as we'd love there to be a manual, the best way to plan housing there, and Commerce's manual, great, but these kinds of details are decided at this level. And so those discussions just gotta happen. So, but that's not to say they wouldn't. And I think what Bongo and Tate, and I think the rest of the subcommittee would ask and would hope for is some direction at the macro scale from this body, which helps us to consider those options at the subcommittee level.
So I think as we have these discussions, and I asked the folks from PTAC here, it's important to remember that we talk about AMIs and methods and weighting. I'm not sure, and we'll just say it for the group, because I'm not sure how many of us really understand that we have to budget for 30% of the county's AMI. A rent for that 30%, a monthly rent is $525. That's the type of units we are looking at needing to produce to meet that monthly rent. And so that's the whole thing. We can allocate all this housing around all we want. But if we don't have ways, And I see Joel going, no way, man. If we don't have ways to, if we're not thinking about how we're gonna subsidize this, or how we're gonna fund this, or where we're gonna locate this housing and how we're gonna make this attractive to developers. We can have all the machinations on these that we need to have to hopefully set the table, but we've really gotta be thinking about. That's that number, that's 525 a month. So as we have these discussions going forward, we need to keep that cognizant in our head.
And I'm just gonna check one last time for questions, being respectful of time, I'm gonna kick it over to Kate, to talk about CPPs if we don't have anything else.
Anything out there?
I don't have any raised hands.
Great, thank you. So yeah, move along.
I will also try to keep this brief because I know we have other items on the agenda, but I'm just gonna go over progress on the CPP housing update. So back in 2022, before Bongo and I's time, the CPPs were updated, but the housing topic was deferred because of the anticipated new housing requirements. I won't go over the new housing requirements because Dave just did that, but that is the reason we are creating this new draft. So far, we've done quite a bit of involvement and outreach with our PTAC, both the full body and the housing subcommittee. We also created the CPP subcommittee that's been involved. We've reached out to stakeholder groups like housing advocates and builders. And we've also reached out to the public. This was posted on our website for this meeting. And we've also done a public workshop through the County Planning Commission. So the current progress, Bongo and I produced the first draft back in May, which was shared with our subcommittee, and we got feedback on. The CPP subcommittee was created in June, and then we sort of received iterative feedback through both May and June working on this. On June 18th, which was still the first draft, is when we circulated it to those stakeholders. So we took that feedback from the stakeholders, the feedback we're getting from PTAC and the CPP subcommittee. And then the last CPP subcommittee discussion happened on July 10th. And so we took feedback from stakeholders, PTAC, that CPP feedback, and incorporated it on July 12th, which is what we call draft 2, and that is what you folks have in front of you. Just to go over briefly on the general feedback we got, there was a lot of concerns around the prescriptiveness of the language. We sort of got conflicting feedback on how prescriptive the language should be, but the intent of the latest edits were to balance this feedback. We also got proposed changes such as general edits for clarity. Again, that softening or specifying of language, as well as strategy recommendations to include in the policies themselves. So upcoming today, the preview of the progress so far. We plan on recirculating the draft after some more iterations on July 26th. Get more feedback, and then through August, we have a planning commission work session and a public hearing. And our goal is to have a PTAC recommendation on CPPs by September. That is all I have on this. So we are open to questions now.
Questions, Mr. White?
I apologize, I was on the housing committee and I owe apologies to the county, because I didn't receive the information, just hadn't seen it. It was right on session July 3rd, so I missed it. But I didn't have a lot of comments during the process, but I do have some questions on the housing section, affordable housing. One, it's a fundamental issue. I know it's already in the plan right now, it's already in our affordable housing section. There is a challenge, and I'm all for environmental sustainability. I believe we should factor that. There's many other segments of the GMA that's already talked about. Traditionally, environmental sustainability adds cost to housing, the rules we put in place. This is a housing affordability section, so we have sort of a conflicting desire to do this, but also talk about that. So I guess we already have a number of rules in our planning process about environmental sustainability. Does that section, at least looking at the requirements of what's required, do we have to have that in this section? I'm just asking that question. Does it have to be here?
It's not a requirement for the housing section specifically. That is something of note is that we are going to be writing climate resiliency CPP topics specifically. And so that feedback was given in the drafting of the first one.
Yeah, I do believe that climate resiliency, again, for affordable housing is probably, there is a lot of ties to that, so I'm just asking the question right now.
Yeah.
How do we factor that in? Because if you look at all the different rules that we've added the last few years with energy efficiency and everything else, is added to the cost, not only for new construction, single family detached homes, but for apartment homes and condos and everything, and those, all the costs have been added to the housing. So if you look at why we have housing challenges, part of it because all the new environmental rules we've added to those issues. So I'm just bringing that as a factor, so we say this about affordable housing, but then we sort of counter argue ourselves. Thank you. Okay, second point.
Resiliency piece be coming to us.
Yeah, the CPP, we have a climate resiliency subcommittee of the PTAC, and it seems like they're gonna start drafting those CPPs. I forget the exact timeline, I think, on what those will be presented to you, but they will be presented.
I'll just say, for me, the emphasis should be on affordability, and that should be the number one priority.
But I did have a second point, on this new proposal to, it says consider adopting through incentives requirements tree canopy standards for new housing developments. Again, I'm all for tree canopy, I believe it helps our city. There are challenges, especially in some outlying areas of our community. Right now, we have a moratorium at Latah Valley because of tree canopy issues tied to climate and fire risk. So and also there's another issue with this too, is that, as you guys know, water issues, we're trying to zero escape our houses. Now we're gonna require more irrigation because trees don't just, in our climate, don't grow, unless you talk about random trees that grow outside the freeway, without there's not the greatest trees, you're not gonna build those with your homes. The trees don't just pop up without irrigation, so they're not sustainable without irrigation. So we're gonna be tapping our aquifer or other things for this. So we're basically going back to all the different issues I'm looking at. So I'm not saying that having tree canopy is not potentially a good thing, but something we need to be thinking about is that all the different impacts that have, because then you're putting this on infrastructure, so you're gonna have to have more quantity of water provided to support that tree canopy, expand tree canopy. So those are things that we just need to think about when we're talking about all these issues. So this is the desire of us to include this in affordable housing section. I mean, that's a cost to our community, so you cannot provide those monies. Now you're gonna use on this, we'll not be able to subsidize housing. So just thinking about where this should be put in our planning, and I'm not, again, not trying to say no or yes, it's just, this is a concern that I have. We want all these things, but we don't have the money to provide it.
Thank you.
Ms. Waldron.
Well, I like having a section in there, and we can have further discussion on the wording, but right now it just talks about incentives or encouragement. So it's not talking about any regulations, so, I mean.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing to consider. Especially with energy efficiency for folks living in affordable housing, so that we lower everyone's costs over time, but. I mean, maybe we can consider that alongside the climate resiliency chapter and see if we can make.
I would say it shouldn't be here, or should it be something else in the document for discussion.
Sure, yeah.
I do think we keep energy costs lower. There's ways to do that. It is a benefit to those who are the income. Challenge, so there are challenges.
I know, it's again. Kind of
You're
different
gonna
policies.
pay a
that
significant amount
sometimes
up front, but maybe over the life of that project, you will get returned back, and so those are something.
We're gonna see that as we have issues.
Yeah.
So, any other questions? Not seeing anything from our remote participants, not seeing anything here, gentlemen. Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, we are going to to combine the last three elements, the LCA update, the interlocal agreement for tribal participation, and the review of the calendar into a brief presentation by Mr. Chesney. He will cover those for us and explain our next step with those. Steph?
Thank you. Yeah, these are all information items. The LCA, the county has been working on our version of that. We were going to share some of that with you. We'll do it very briefly. We know the city and City of the Valley are working on theirs. We are also reaching out to the small cities and offering a partnership from the county's staff to help them work through this. And I'll hit this one really quickly. Yes. Thanks. You've seen that chart before. The issue from the county's perspective is the unincorporated inside UGA number of 30,000 plus 31,000 that we're working with. You've seen this methodology before under considerations. And here's the kind of a quick macro bottom line that we have seen on our side. And that is we've got roughly that 2,200 acres of vacant land currently zoned for some kind of residential densities or rural. And the rural lands are included in this, in the dwelling unit capacity at their existing rural allowances. So if it's on a 5-acre lot, there's only one house attached to that. That will be refined as we go through, but what we're seeing is the population capacity of what exists in the existing acreage is about 30,000, and we're looking for 31,000. So essentially, we're saying right now, there may be enough acres in the UGA to accommodate the population in our side. It doesn't mean they're in the right place, however, but it does mean on a very big scale. There may not be a gross expansion as we redraw that UGA bound.
Just to clarify, this includes the city of Spokane data?
No, this is only unincorporated UGAs. And the planning commission and the county board have seen this presentation, so we're opening that discussion. There's also this other factor, almost 1,700 acres that are in an urban growth area from the 1990s at the birth of GMA, where our predecessors threw a dart at the wall, made us best guess. We have this new thing called an urban growth area. We need to put one around Medical Lake or Mayor Cooper, around Cheney and these others. Well, as we've seen, most of those small areas have not grown into those UGAs that were allocated for them. And so as we go through this assessment and we help Medical Lake grow, for example, their UGA is very likely going to be on their east side where they've got the ability to serve that with capital facilities, they have better transportation facilities. It's outside of the Fairchild J-Luz corridors where their current one is there. But those UGAs are going to be scaled to the growth in those smaller cities, which means a lot of this rural acreage will be eliminated from the UGA. So in a sense, there's going to be a balancing act. Where do we need to grow that has services? You know, Valley UGA is a big example. The north part of the metro UGA, the West Valley that we've seen. Can we reallocate these acres so that we have, you know, close to a net zero increase in the UGA as it stands? That's a goal different from this group, but that's part of our settlement agreement that said we should not grow beyond the size of the UGA. Well, if we can balance the uses we have, we might be able to meet that goal. If we can't, we'll be able to defend that difference based on the UGA analysis. But it's going to be a different discussion. And these are just on the county side, those tan areas are essentially the urban reserve zones. Those were the ones our predecessors anticipated growing into at this time. And they were left to keep bigger lot sizes, minimum 20-acre lot sizes. Some of them have been carved up anyway, and so we're dealing with that. And some of them are not likely to be suitable, or for example, they're going to be very large. So there's that. That's the UGA itself. We've seen that before. We will send you these slides so that you can see what's going on. You put up the tribal piece. And we will send you this too. It's obviously it's more detailed. This is the interlocal that goes all the way back to the 1990s with comments from the subcommittee working on this interlocal agreement, as well as comments from some of the tribal representatives at Commerce. We would ask you to take a look at this on your own time and provide comments back through us, and we will bring those to the subcommittee. We would anticipate bringing this back to you for action at your September meeting.
So I will ask real quick while this is up, is there anybody remotely that has any comments, who has read this, has any comments for Mr. Chesney at this time? Or questions?
The new comments came last night, so that was not circulated.
Oh, this was not circulated, okay. So please review this.
I didn't circulate.
Thank you.
And then the last item on your agenda, we are on a tight timeline. 2 years sounds like a long time to get project done. It is not, especially in an intergovernmental sense here. We spent almost an hour and some time talking about some of the details on one aspect of our process on housing and redevelopment. So we're going to try to make sure we're creating a work plan that is manageable for PTAC, for subcommittees that are created for you and for your subcommittees. With this as sort of a tentative starting line for that. This was sent out, we'll send it out again. We will use this and get to our new leadership team. Will be meeting with them in advance of these meetings. We'll go over this calendar, we'll go over that work plan. And what is pointing out though is something that Dave pointed out and Kevin. Dave's slide about the nested decisions making. As we move along, we need to make decisions and use them to build the rest of this, or we'll never get this thing totally completed by June of 26. And even there, 2026 doesn't allow us a full year. The goal is for the county commissioners to adopt this at their last meeting in June 30th. That's where it'll be before this steering committee, at the very least in May. All of that has to happen. So it's a shortened horizon a little bit. And we will adjust this based on the needs of the jurisdictions and the steering committee. But we are going to have to create a work plan and stick to it to get through this. Ms. Walrath.
Oh, I know that we adopted the initial allocations.
Yes.
And now all the jurisdictions are going back and looking at their UGAs and looking at where they can accommodate different types of growth. And then they're gonna come back if they want to have a change in what the initial allocations was. So where in the timeline does that happen?
It has to happen by the time we get to the UGA refinement.
Is that UGA refinement January of next year?
Yeah, our goal would be to have that UGA, have all of those allocations made so that we know both what the math looks like and the geography looks like roughly by the end of the year, or that this group would work on it in January.
Just a note that on November 20th, we have our Washington State Association of Counties meeting. So the county commissioners meeting, we might all be remote unless you want to do that date.
You need to figure out your priorities. You can hear. No,
I don't think we could be in two places at once, but anyway, just FYI.
There's 5 of you, someone to that.
And so, yes, especially if any of the steering committee members have suggestions on the sequencing here, or for that matter, conflicts or other ideas, send them to us as quickly as you can, and we will adapt them into the schedule. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have.
Any final comments or questions for Mr. Chesney? Any final comments or questions for the good of the order? Not seeing, Mr. Birch.
Yes, a couple of meetings back, and I apologize not attending the last meeting. I had a family conflict. Made a request, as well as I think the school district did, to have the committee consider having the fire districts and the school districts become voting members of the committee. I hadn't heard any response back. I know the Inland Empire Fire Chiefs weighed in on this topic, and I was just curious where that stands at this point.
We heard the request. We have been focusing on the tribal participation because that's a legislative mandate. But when we come back in September, we will put an option on the group table for this group.
Okay, great.
We don't know precisely how that was created the first time around, but if this group chooses to create more voting members, that'll be entirely your decision.
So
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Birch. So that will be included as the next, that will be included in the next draft?
Yeah.
Draft, okay, so we will have that element in there. And then any other questions? Any concerns? Our next meeting is September.
Yes.
So everybody gets a month off, and so at this time, with seeing no action, do I have, oh, sorry. Oh, public comments. I am very sorry to the members of the public. Is there anyone in this room or remotely from the public that wishes to make remarks to this board, this organization, entity? Anyone? Second call. Third and final call, seeing no one rising to make comments. Then at this time, do I have a motion for adjournment? Moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you all. This meeting is adjourned.